you wake before the sun. The smell hits you before you even open your eyes. It clings to your skin, your hair, your clothes. No matter how many times you scrub yourself raw in the cold river water, it never fully leaves. You step outside into the dark streets, and people who were walking toward you suddenly cross to the other side. They don't look at you. They never look at you. Some cover their noses. Others spit on the ground as you pass. You're not a criminal. You haven't hurt anyone. But in their eyes, you're something worse. You're contaminated. You're disgusting. And the worst part is, they need you. They absolutely need you, but they'll never admit it. This was life in early 18th-century London, a city swelling with people but drowning in its own filth. There were no sewers as we know them today, no underground pipes carrying waste away to treatment plants. Instead, human waste piled up in wooden barrels, stone pits, and shallow cellars beneath homes. Wealthy families had private cesspits dug deep under their properties. Poor families shared communal latrines that overflowed into alleyways. The smell during summer months was unbearable. Disease spread quickly. Cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever killed thousands every year. The city couldn't function like this, but it did because there were men willing to do the job no one else would touch. They were called night soil men, gong farmers, or simply night workers. Their job was to remove human waste by hand, haul it through the streets in the dead of night, and dispose of it outside the city walls. Without them, London would have drowned in its own sewage, but society treated them like they were less than human. His name was Thomas. He was 23 years old when he started. He didn't choose this work because he wanted to. He chose it because his father had died 2 months earlier, and his mother and younger sisters had no income. His father had been a dock worker, strong and healthy, until a barrel crushed his chest during an unloading accident. There was no compensation, no funeral fund, just a body and a family that couldn't afford to eat. Thomas tried to find other work. He asked at the docks, the markets, the warehouses. But there were always more men than jobs, and Thomas had no connections, no trade skills, no leverage. Then one night, a night soil crew supervisor approached him outside a tavern. The man knew desperation when he saw it. He offered Thomas a position on his crew. The pay was better than most laboring jobs, but there was a reason for that. Thomas asked how bad it could really be. The supervisor just laughed and told him to show up at midnight if he wanted to find out. Thomas didn't sleep that night. He thought about his mother's face, thin and tired. He thought about his sisters, too young to work, too hungry to play. He showed up at midnight. The work began after dark because the city banned night soil removal during daylight hours. The smell and the sight offended the public, so the job had to be invisible. Thomas and the crew met in a narrow courtyard behind a row of cramped tenement houses. The supervisor handed him a wooden bucket, a long-handled shovel, and a piece of cloth to tie around his face. It didn't help much. The first cesspit they opened was behind a boarding house. It was a stone-lined hole about 6 feet deep, filled nearly to the top with human waste that had been accumulating for months. The stench was so thick it felt solid. Thomas gagged immediately. The other men didn't react. They'd been doing this for years. One of them climbed down into the pit with a bucket and began scooping. The waste was thick, mixed with urine, feces, rotting food scraps, and things Thomas couldn't identify. They hauled it up bucket by bucket and dumped it into a large cart waiting in the alley. Thomas's job was to carry the buckets from the pit to the cart. The waste sloshed over the sides and onto his hands, his arms, his boots. It soaked through the cloth he'd tied over his face. He vomited twice in the first hour. The supervisor told him he'd get used to it. He never did. Every night was the same. They moved from house to house, pit to pit, emptying filth that most people pretended didn't exist. The work was slow and exhausting. A single cesspit could take hours to empty, and they had to finish before sunrise. If they were still working when people started waking, they'd be shouted at, threatened, sometimes attacked. Thomas learned quickly that the public hated seeing them, even though every single person in the city produced waste and benefited from its removal. They wanted to pretend the night soil men didn't exist. Thomas would walk home at dawn, covered in filth, and people would cross the street to avoid him. Shopkeepers refused to serve him. Landlords wouldn't rent to him. He was forced to live in a crumbling boarding house on the edge of the city where other night soil workers stayed. Even there, they were isolated from the rest of society. Children threw rocks at them. Strangers shouted insults. Thomas stopped trying to explain what he did. There was no point. People didn't want to understand. They just wanted him to stay away. The psychological damage was worse than the physical labor. Thomas began to see himself the way others saw him. Dirty, contaminated, less than human. He stopped looking people in the eye. He stopped talking unless he had to. At night, he worked in silence, moving through the city like a ghost. He scrubbed his skin until it bled, but the smell never fully disappeared. It lived in his pores, in his hair, under his fingernails. He started to believe he was disgusting. He started to believe he deserved the hatred. His mother tried to comfort him, but even she struggled to embrace him when he came home. His sisters stopped inviting him to sit with them at meals. He ate alone in the corner of their single room, ashamed of what he'd become. He thought about quitting, but there was no other work that paid enough to keep them alive. So he kept going. Every night, every pit, every bucket. He disappeared into the work, piece by piece, until there was almost nothing left of the person he used to be. Think about that for a moment. Imagine doing work that keeps your entire community healthy and functional, but being treated like you're worthless because of it. Imagine being so essential that the city would collapse without you, but so despised that no one will even acknowledge your existence. Could you do that job? Could you live with that kind of rejection every single day, knowing it would never end? Could you keep going when everyone around you treats you like you're contaminated, like you're something to be avoided and forgotten? The physical dangers were constant. Night soil men died regularly, but their deaths were rarely recorded. Thomas saw a man fall into a deep cesspit one night when the edge crumbled beneath him. The pit was almost 12 feet deep, and the man sank immediately into the thick sludge. They tried to pull him out, but the waste was too heavy, and he couldn't breathe. He drowned in human filth while 4 men stood above him, helpless. They reported it to the parish, but no investigation followed. The man's name wasn't even written down. He was just another night soil worker, replaceable and forgotten. Disease was even more common than accidents. Cholera, typhoid, and dysentery spread easily through contact with waste. Thomas watched men on his crew grow sick, weaken, and die within weeks. There was no medical care available to them. Doctors refused to treat night soil men, either out of disgust or fear of contamination. Thomas himself fell ill twice, burning with fever and unable to keep food down. Both times, he recovered only because he was young and his body fought through it. Older men weren't so lucky, and even if you survived the disease, your body broke down from the work itself. The constant bending, lifting, and carrying destroyed backs and knees. The toxic fumes from the waste damaged lungs. Most night soil men didn't live past 40. But here's something most people don't know, something that makes this even darker. Night soil wasn't just dumped outside the city and forgotten. It was valuable. Farmers bought it as fertilizer for their fields. Human waste was rich in nutrients, and it helped crops grow faster and stronger. The night soil crews didn't just remove filth for free. They sold it. And the supervisors, the men who ran the crews, made significant money from these sales. But the workers themselves, the men like Thomas who actually did the labor, saw almost none of that profit. They were paid a small daily wage, just enough to survive, while the supervisors got wealthy. The crew bosses had deals with farmers, tanners, and even some factory owners who used human waste in their production processes. It was an entire underground economy built on something people were ashamed to talk about. And the workers at the bottom, the ones who suffered the most, were exploited twice. Once by society's disgust, and once by the men who profited from their labor. Now ask yourself this. If someone today offered you triple your current salary to do a job that would make everyone you know treat you like you were contaminated and worthless, would you take it? What if your family was starving? What if it was the only option left? How much money would it take for you to accept being hated for doing something necessary? And how long do you think you could last before it broke you? Most men didn't last more than 5 years. The combination of physical strain, disease, and social isolation destroyed them. Some quit and disappeared into extreme poverty, unable to find other work because of the stigma. Others drank themselves to death, trying to forget what they did every night. A few went mad, wandering the streets talking to themselves, no longer able to distinguish between the waste they carried and their own humanity. Thomas made it 3 years. That was longer than most. But by the end, he was barely recognizable. He'd lost weight. His skin had a grayish tone. His hands shook constantly, even when he wasn't working. He coughed up blood some mornings. His mother begged him to stop, but he couldn't. His sisters were older now, but still too young to support the family alone. He was trapped. Every night, he climbed down into another pit. Every night, he carried another bucket. Every night, he became a little less human. Thomas died on a cold November morning in 1728. He'd been emptying a particularly deep cesspit behind a merchant's house when he collapsed. The other men pulled him out and laid him on the street. But he didn't wake up. A doctor passing by refused to examine him, saying he wouldn't touch a night soil man. Thomas died there on the cobblestones, surrounded by men who worked beside him, but barely knew his name. His body was taken to a pauper's grave outside the city. No marker, no ceremony. His mother and sisters weren't even notified until 3 days later. He was 26 years old. He'd spent 3 years keeping London functional, and the city didn't pause for even a moment to acknowledge his death. Another young man took his place on the crew that same week. The work never stopped. It couldn't. The city needed it too badly. Society built itself on the backs of men like Thomas. Every clean street, every home without overflowing waste, every reduction in disease rates came because someone was willing to do the job everyone else refused. But the same society that benefited refused to honor that sacrifice. Night soil men were essential and invisible at the same time. They kept the city alive, but they were treated as if they contaminated it. The irony is almost unbearable. These men touched the waste that every single person produced, the waste that every household generated, and they were hated for it. They made normal life possible, and their reward was isolation, sickness, and early death. The system didn't just fail them. It was designed to exploit them. It relied on their desperation, used their labor, and discarded them when they broke. And everyone pretended that was acceptable. Everyone pretended they didn't exist until the cesspits overflowed and the smell became unbearable. Then suddenly, the night soil men mattered again, but only until the work was done. Thomas wasn't the only one. There were hundreds like him in London alone, and thousands more in cities across England and Europe. Men who gave up their health, their dignity, and their lives to do work that no one else would touch, and most of them died without anyone remembering their names. But their work shaped the cities we live in today. The sewer systems we take for granted, the sanitation standards we assume are normal, the public health measures that keep us safe. All of it started because men like Thomas did the work that made people realize something had to change. They didn't live to see that change. They didn't benefit from it. They just suffered and died and were forgotten. And if you think that's the worst job in history, you're wrong. There were others, jobs that were even more dangerous, even more degrading, even more invisible, jobs that broke people faster and left even less behind.